In Islam, the interweaving of the rational with the jurisprudential and with the ethical creates what some people have called the moral economy. That is a set of requirements that govern the actions of the individual as well as the collective when it comes to economic transactions and when it comes to what is known as muamalat. So the moral aspect, the aspect of meaning that is implicit in any action, meaning and purpose and direction, creates an ideal which is the Islamic economic person or economic man, which is not necessarily a person who has all the characteristics or even some of the characteristics of what Adam Smith called the bartering savage, which is the basis of all the individualist utilitarian conceptions of economic man. And it is here, I think, where the retreat of the outer aspects of Islam has been most pronounced. Muslims in the last 2 centuries, for a variety of reasons, because of the impact of the West in terms of their intrusion into the Muslim lands, in terms of the wholesale makeover of Muslim societies, their legal forms, their commercial forms, and the secularization that came in its wake, followed by the period throughout most of the 20th century where Muslim societies, in one way or another, came under the control of secularizing groups who base their entire political ideology and their entire political ethic, as it were, on a conscious reworking of the Islamic legacy. This process, this accumulation of these changes, had a profound effect on the individual's understanding, the individual Muslim's understanding of what constitutes moral worth as it relates to economic transactions. So the detailed sets of rulings that governed the outer aspects of economic life, which were in some ways underpinned by an inner state that posited, as it were, the ethical dimension for all personal action, became loosened and then began to fragment. In addition to that, the outer forms that propped up this world, the outer forms of laws, the outer forms of institutions, the outer forms of markets, bazaars, the way in which people conducted their work, their daily life, all that became radically altered. Now, I'm not speaking about the effects on the workplace, for example, that took place in the West in the last, say, 100, 150 years. Obviously, they were in some ways equally, if not more dramatic. But they basically took place in a frame, in an arena, which was defined by the purposes and the scaffolding of the modern world. In the case of those who came from an entirely different worldview, from an entirely different perspective, with a different assignment as to values, the worth of things, the change became extremely traumatic and created this great break, this massive disruption. You can't really trace it at any point in time, but it has been creeping up since the end of the 19th century and accelerating in recent times. And this cleavage between what people think is the moral economy, as it were, of Islam, and the realities, the pragmatic, quote-unquote, realities of having to deal with the exigencies of the time and place has created, I believe, this schism in the minds as well as in the actions of Muslims. Modern economic and business institutions were imported wholesale, from the limited liability company to the interest-based world of modern banking and insurance. The foreign rules that followed these, when I say foreign, I don't mean that they were alien. but rather they were alien to the construct of the Islamic mind, were introduced wholesale and debunked, overthrew, basically, established systems and modes that have been going on for hundreds of years. So, Belgian commercial codes, British Company Acts, French banking ordinances, all supplanted the Sharia. And with it, I think, more importantly, an entire new judicial system came into being that governed the world of business and commerce. And you had an entirely new set of commercial rules superimposed on a world that was still in many ways linked to a worldview that was, I won't say antithetical, but an alternative, posited an alternative to modernity. And with these new economic horizons, of course, came new risks, including borrowing at unsustainable rates. And I can tell you this from first-hand experience in Iraq. But I think if you look at it historically, the massive indebtedness of Egypt or the Ottomans to foreign bankers and creditors in the latter part of the 19th century was a central element in the decline of Muslim power. It culminated in spectacular bankruptcies and the takeover, the actual direct takeover of these states by Western creditors. So we're a long way, I suppose, from that period. But in reality, from my own experience, we're a long way only in terms of the forms. In reality, the control mechanisms, as it were, that oblige countries to fit in within a system that is becoming increasingly interlinked and increasingly dominated by huge concentrations of resources and of capital is one that is we have no escape from. Now, in the Muslim world, capitalist enterprise developed very rapidly with the overthrow of the old economic order. And if you look throughout from the colonial banks that were established in North Africa and the Middle East, some of them are predecessors of the great names that we know now, as well as national banks, banks that were established by local capitalists, by indigenous businessmen, became a very important part in the modernization. But the modernization of these countries and states along a path that had already broken effectively with the legacy of Islam. Then the last wave, as it were, that has hit us, that has hit the Muslim world, as well as Muslims in the West, I would say, too, because they have, in fact, another ball that they have to juggle with, which is their role as citizens in the countries in which to which they belong. And that is the increasing pace of globalization and how that is going to affect the debate on the future of the Muslim economy. If the world is going to be integrated according to the norms of multinational or transnational capital, if it's going to be integrated by the dismantling of barriers to trade, by dismantling of barriers to capital, but not to labor, I might add, is going to have a profound effect. Yet another set of variables are going to impinge on the Muslim world and on the mind of Muslims, trying to create institutions that reflect their inner conditions and their inner state. And with globalization comes what can be called universalization of economic values, particularly things like market values. And it seems to be a process that is pushing for a certain prevalence of an order that does not accept or legitimate great differences at its base. It will accept and maybe welcome differences at the surface. And so we have all this talk about pluralism and multiculturalism and all of that. But these are, in my mind, just froth on the surface. At its roots is a way or perspective on the world that is by and large rooted in the acknowledgement that there are certain ways and practices and processes and certain forces which have such power and have such inexorable reach that they are likely to prevail and predominate. And anyone or any group of people positing an alternative or refusing, as it were, to acknowledge the validity of these at all times, at all places, become in some ways marginalized. Now, I don't want to say that there's a conspiracy. There is no such thing as a conspiracy, but there are certain forces that coalesce and push in certain directions. There's no doubt, if you look at the world in the last 20 years, the prevalence, as it were, of the Washington consensus originally, and the way it has evolved, and the constant formulation of economic policies and theories and prescriptions based upon events and circumstances that are unique to a period, they are then universalized and given a cachet that this is best international practice. But the ball keeps on changing. And as the ball changes, the distance between the average Muslim, as it were, who's conscious of his ethical and religious obligations, and the establishment of this moral economy that we talk about, becomes ever greater and far more distant. Of course, this applies also to Islamic banking, I'm afraid, is that what was, in my mind, the single most important experiment in the last 30 or 40 years in trying to realize or crystallize the institutional basis of a new Islamic economic order has, for a variety of reasons, been seriously shunted on a different track. A track where the rules of transactions might be obeyed in their strict, narrow sense, but their purpose and their meaning is lost. And there is a disjunction between the way in which Islamic finance and banking has evolved and the way that at least the ideals of an Islamic economy would indicate. And I'm not the only person who's made that comment. I'm sure there are several quite serious academics and scholars, as well as practitioners, I might add, who have made that very same observation, that in the demand for being competitive, the demand for being flexible and pragmatic, certain paths are chosen which eliminate an alternative route. Maybe that alternative route could not have been forthcoming. Maybe it was just a gleam in people's eye. But those who were the pioneers of the Islamic banking movement in the 1960s and 70s, from the first banks that were established, would, I think, confirm that this has passed into a entirely different arena. And this brings me to another very, very important observation as to the way in which the modern or the postmodern world has affected the Muslim mind, is what I would call the principle of inversion. And that ideas and values and states, as it were, are inverted from their original meaning. And as a result, the way the terminologies, the way in which people derive meaning out of concepts changes entirely, takes on a different hue and a different shape. And in the process, the connection with the legacy is lost. I'll give you an example. The word, for economics in Arabic is iqtisad. Now, if you ask any person what iqtisad means, they will tell you it's to do with scarcity, it's to do with saving, it's to do with, in some ways, hoarding even. But in reality, iqtisad does not mean that. Iqtisad means the middle way. It means the way between two alternatives, the golden mean, as it were. If you look at the idea of welfare, just the whole principles underlying welfare economics or charity, they are an inversion of the principle of zakat. Zakat in Islam is not just an act of public finance. It is not some way by which an individual salves his or her conscience. It is an obligatory act. Welfare, once you start thinking of it and inverting it from being an obligatory act to an act that maximizes social welfare and social benefits, that element, that connection with the ethical underpinnings, which ultimately in Islam is to do with the belief in the unseen, is lost. And you talk about markets, for example. Markets in Islam have a specific function, have a specific meaning. They are places, there are three kinds of markets in Islam. There are the markets where the actual physical goods are brought on a daily basis, which are the markets for produce. Then there are the markets for goods that have a longer shelf life, as it were, and the markets for manufacturers, for processes. Then there are the markets that happen occasionally in great fairs, as it were. They are not the same as the idea of the market that is implicit in Western economic thought. So when you talk about that markets in Islam have to have the same structures, as it were, as modern liberal economic theory, then it is not really true. Markets in Islam are highly regulated affairs. They are to do, as this great social philosopher Karl Polanyi said, they are socially embedded structures. It is society that governs, that drives markets. Markets are never allowed to set the agenda. And this was true, I might add, here also in the Western world. Until they recently, the cult of the market is not something that would have been easily palatable to the average person here. Markets implied a kind of self-regulating mechanism, which in reality required a state, required a set of detailed regulations, detailed support structures to keep the idea, so-called, of free markets going. The idea of man in terms, when I say man, I mean human beings, so please accept this as gender neutral, is to do with the moral actions that underlie transactions. The idea of homo economicus, as it were, in Islamic theory, is just simply unknown. It's unheard of. It's unheard of that a person can act simply constrained by laws and constrained by what he or she can get away with in terms of their self-interest. So the concept of what drives economic activity is different. Again, I don't want to say that Islam is alone in this. It's not. In the 19th century in the Western world, especially in the Anglo-Saxon countries, you had huge organizations, huge institutions develop, prompted by this desire for social action as part of human dignity, as part of human worth. You have the Quakers, for example, the Christian distributists, great industries. The entire building society movement was based on cooperative finance. The great chocolate manufacturers here, Cadbury, even in the United States, Hershey, were driven by a highly developed sense of the moral responsibility of a businessman, not of the corporation. It has nothing to do with social corporate responsibility, quote unquote. It's to do with individual moral acts. And out of that, enormous enterprises and entire cities were born. If anybody goes to Birmingham, you see Bourneville there. If you go and see the great experiments in communal living in urban cities of the Victorian era, you can see what it meant to have an ethical drive behind business actions. And so production simply for gain is not part of the Islamic or any ethical system's human order. The meaning of profit in the Quran, for example, which is either, it's used interchangeably, ribh, or fawz, or kasb. It is more to do with success, it's more to do with attainment of knowledge that brings you closer to realizing your potential as a human being. It is not to do with profit in the sense of accumulation of a surplus as a result of a transaction. The idea of risk, for example, in Islam, again, it is unknown. The word for risk is we say risk means mukhatara in Arabic, and the other languages of Islam, which is about the same. But that's really meaning of avoiding a physical danger. It does not really have the implication that it does in actuarial tables. Risk is something that does not feature in the calculations of an economically driven person. You take all the consequences into account. You try to do your best, but once you act, you do not try to control the way in which that action unfolds in the future. So it is to do more with, it is in some ways seen as an affront, as it were, both to the human and to the divine order, to claim that you can somehow control your actions in the future. So gains in individual material welfare, which is an underlying factor that drives economic activity in modern times, in Islam is always seen as leading to a commensurate reduction of social welfare, of social cohesion. And I think, again, it is not that different from many societies here in the West before the last 30 years. And if unchecked, this way is going to lead, and has led, to a profound loss of the social center that is a necessary element of any Islamic order. The commodification of land, labor, and money is something, again, that is not known either in Islamic theory or in practice. The idea that labor itself can have a wage value, and that you can see human labor primarily in the form of what it's to be, how it is to be remunerated, is, I must say, alien to the structures of Islam's economic life.